This podcast is brought to you in part by Patch. Patch is the marketplace for negative emissions that makes it easy for businesses to neutralise their carbon footprint through a network of high-quality carbon removal projects. A perfect fit for this show, don't you think, Tom?
100%. Patch enables companies in fintech, travel, e-commerce and more to estimate emissions and embed carbon removal directly into their products or services, all with just a few lines of code. This means businesses and their end customers can be more sustainable and participate in automated climate action. Head to patch.io today to find out more.
You'll notice that during this episode, Tom and I have a conversation with Brennan, the CEO of Patch. Don't worry, this interview took place long before we reached out to Patch about sponsorship. So our journalistic integrity is intact and there's no funny business.
Emily, I need some context. Where have all these names come from?
They've come from my head, Tom. Here's the thing. If we're going to get serious about starting a carbon removal business, we need a catchy, bright, shiny, beautiful business name. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So let me just run some by you and you can tell me what you think. So this one is beautiful and slightly outside of the box. Out of thin air.
Snappy. That's snappy, yeah.
How about Yes We Carbo Can?
I don't know about that one.
That's like channeling Barack Obama.
I tell you which one I do like. I really, for some reason, love the Biochar Bakery.
My Little Biochar Bakery?
There's something that just, I don't know, when a great idea just hits you like lightning. I just think that there's something in that.
Yeah, it's kind of homely. It's like a little family business. We're community, local sourced biochar.
What about this one, Tom and the Skyscrapers?
Tom and the Skyscrapers. I mean, it's a great band name if you ever want to put together like a musical group. Yeah, I mean, maybe let's go for it. I don't know.
I mean, I don't want to know what you were eating or consuming when you came up with these names. But they're great. I'm inspired. Welcome back to the Carbon Removal Show. My name is Tom Praviti and I'm joined as ever by Emily Swaddle.
Today we'll be asking the question, how do we scale up?
In our last episode, we talked about your dream, Emily, of starting a biochar business.
Indeed we did. And we established that I currently don't even have a garden. So this dream is very small scale right now.
Yes, but one day, Emily, one day.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm going to do this, I have to get around to it pretty quickly. We're up against the clock a bit here.
Yeah, and it's got to be as large scale as your future garden can manage as well.
Yeah, right. My Little Biochar Bakery needs to go global ASAP.
Yeah, and carbon removal just needs to go big in general. And depending on who you talk to and depending on how well we decarbonise, we have to be removing gigatons by 2050.
Currently, the solutions that we've discussed are working at the scale of removing tons or maybe thousands of tons, but we need to get to billions of tons. B for billions of tons. We have such a long way to go to get to a gigaton scale.
Yeah, it's a big leap and we need to make it quickly.
Of the range of removal techniques we've discussed in this series, not only are none of them at that scale yet, but no single technology is going to get us there all on its own.
Alongside serious decarbonisation, we're just going to need a plethora of different techniques of carbon removal to just get us anywhere near stabilising or hopefully decreasing that parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere.
Yep. Call it diversity, call it a portfolio approach, call it what you will. We need this for many reasons. Firstly, a lot of the techniques that we looked at have a naturally finite capacity. Trees, for example, everyone's faithful go-to for carbon capture. We can only plant so many trees before we start running out of land, by which I mean competing for land that has other essential uses.
There's also a question of uncertainty. Some techniques are really hard to measure. For example, we don't know exactly how much carbon can be sequestered through regenerative agricultural practices. There's also uncertainty due to our changing climate. So how sure can we be of the permanence of storing carbon in natural sinks when those sinks might be at risk of completely being transformed in the coming decades by temperature increases or extreme weather events?
Oh, terrifying but true. These uncertainties are another reason to not put all our eggs in one basket here. As for tech or engineered solutions, we've talked about how much potential there is for some of the innovations popping up in this space, but they really are just little baby technologies at this stage. Fresh from the drawing board, so new to this world. And realistically, these newer techniques will take years to scale up to somewhere meeting our demands.
We've talked in our previous episodes about the limitations of each of the techniques that we touched on, and you know them already. We've got the improvements needed for measurability of nature-based solutions, further development of engineered solutions to make them fully efficient, and of course, permanence issues.
And if you haven't listened to our previous episodes in this series, go back and listen to them because this episode needs a bit of context. Also, they're amazing.
And we've acknowledged that carbon removal is still in its infancy, but we need this technology to develop, and it will develop, but to do so at the urgent pace that we're talking about, we need a lot of people, that's researchers, businesses, working in this space, and with adequate resources to experiment, to innovate, and to deploy their ideas.
Now that we know solutions are out there, in this episode we're diving into that key question: what does the carbon removal space need to get it off the ground? And if we were entrepreneurs in this business, where could we go for support?
As always, we know it's going to be impossible to cover everything in this episode, so we're just going to focus on a few different approaches to the question of scaling up. Let's get going. So, the wider industry as a whole, we know it's new, we know it's young, maybe a little bit hip. What does it need to grow at pace, though?
Okay, thinking back to our last episode, Tom, we know this space needs money. Carbon removal is a very expensive business.
Right. Essentially, without enthusiasm from investors, it's going to be really, really hard to grow this industry.
Yes, support from investors can definitely go down on our wish list, and support from politicians is going at the top of that list too.
Yes, and policy change can provide incentives, create a market, support research. The other need that's been so pervasive throughout the series so far is this idea of doing it well and doing it with care. There needs to be care taken in this industry, essentially, to maintain that positive impact.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, Tom. We can't let the urgency of this matter outweigh making sensible decisions.
Right.
It is essential that we do this quickly, and it is essential that we do it well. So we need an industry that rewards innovative, scalable solutions that are viable on a financial, environmental, and social level.
We're not asking for much then, are we?
Yeah, it's quite a wish list. And we'd like all of that delivered by the end of the decade, please.
I mean, it sounds like we got our hands full for the next decade or so.
Whew, telling me. So, speaking of the work we've got to do, Tom, we might not have the power to influence a whole industry yet, but we do have the agency to start our own carbon removal business, and we can make sure that it ticks all of the boxes that need ticking.
And we have a smorgasbord of names to now choose from.
Right, I think we're practically halfway there.
Let's introduce our first guest. He's been a big hype person for the industry in the last year or so, Marcius Extavour, the Vice President of Energy and Climate at XPRIZE. XPRIZE run public competitions which are intended to encourage technological development to benefit humanity, and their board of trustees includes the likes of James Cameron, Larry Page, and Arianna Huffington. Other XPRIZes have focused on everything from revolutionising our food system to restoring the rainforest, but recently they launched a carbon removal prize, which aims to inspire and help scale efficient solutions to collectively achieve a 10 gigaton per year carbon removal target by 2050. Now, this prize was funded by Elon Musk and the Musk Foundation and gained a huge amount of attention when it was launched. We even covered Musk's tweets about it in episode 2. And with a total prize pot of $100 million, it's actually thought to be the largest incentive prize in history.
Oh, breaking world records. That would pay for my biochar bakery a few times over, I reckon.
Well, I mean, I'd hope it would, because it's a lot of money.
Even when it goes global.
Yeah. But beyond just helping your business, Emily, Marcius explains the rationale behind using a competition to help drive this space forwards.
The goal of the prize is to really grow the ecosystem for carbon removal. We're trying to increase the total global supply of cost-effective, long-term, almost permanent carbon removal solutions. That's the top line goal. Now, how do we go about doing that? We can use a competition format to give folks who have solutions a place to showcase them. We're not asking for an ideas competition, we're asking for a demonstration competition. Show us how your removal solution, and show us how it can scale. Another goal of ours is to prove the scientific and technical validity of some of these solutions. So many carbon removal solutions have been discussed, but not as many have been tried at an appreciable scale. By focusing on a demonstration and a prize, we're hoping to stimulate a lot of demonstrations at a relatively modest scale of different removal solutions, because that's the only path to really getting a good handle on the unit economics, the scalability, the social consequences of possibly scaling up a solution like that. So we're trying to increase the global supply by first asking for just demonstrations. If you've got a great, ocean-based concept, let's see a demo of it. Let's see a pilot. Let's see maybe something larger than a pilot. Let's see the scalable unit at a minimum. And of course, we're trying to accelerate deployment. We're not going to get to 10 gigatons tomorrow, but we are behind schedule if we're going to try to hit that target. That's only 30 years from now. There's very little carbon removal capacity on Earth today. So we're hoping to use the platform of the prize to help accelerate that scale up. And finally, the carbon removal community, despite recent attention, is still fairly small. It's not going to take a few dozen people or a few hundred or a couple thousand people working on this. We're going to need many more people working on this. So one of the goals of the prize, and one of the fun aspects of doing it sort of on a big platform in public, is to try to inspire the next generation. How do we get more young people thinking about this in the same way you're doing with this pod? How do we start to educate, get different ideas, get people talking about it? That's what's going to lead to more ideas, creative ideas, whether they're brand new ways of doing things or just ways to get the solutions we already know about into the market, into the world more quickly, more robustly, more justly. I think we need all of that conversation, and we think a prize is a nice way to try to achieve that.
We've talked so much in recent episodes about how to get businesses to pay for carbon removal that it's refreshing to hear about pure innovation being rewarded simply for its potential rather than its immediate market value. And by pooling their expertise and spreading the prize money across a range of viable projects, it feels like this could be a potentially game-changing way of operating.
Absolutely. Of course, it is worth noting that 100 million isn't going to solve our carbon problem, but the XPRIZE team are fully aware of this.
What we do at XPRIZE is look for topics where we think a prize can actually be helpful. And not every topic and not every problem is well suited to a prize. But if we can find a clear need, some clear reasons why it isn't being funded, or innovation especially isn't being funded by other actors, or we call those, maybe there are structural or market barriers. And if we can identify a clear set of kind of incentives or metrics for a prize, then we think we have something that can work and be helpful. The way I think about prizes is that they're a leverage model. A prize can't solve the entirety of the problem, but it can help to leverage existing other programs, other sources of funding that exist in the community. And if you do a public prize like an XPRIZE, it can really capture people's imagination and drive a lot of conversation and attention. I'll just say too though, $100 million is a huge amount of money for a prize, but it's also still a modest amount when we consider the needs actually. So there's no way that $100 million is enough to get us to 10 gigatons. But we think 100 dispersed through a prize now could really be an effective spark to leverage us much beyond 100 million. Now we've figured out different ways to distribute the capital and the purses through the prize, so it's not 100 million to one winner at the end, it's actually staged out over time. But still, it's largely reward for performance. But we think a prize can be still an effective leverage model, specifically to leverage in other capital. Because we ask and we have rigorous testing, and we require teams to meet a clear objective standard, that we hope helps the competitors actually raise money external to the prize.
So XPRIZE are hoping that where they lead, others will follow. And by targeting the prize at teams with a real chance of getting their ideas off the ground and with the potential to realise them at scale, they're hoping that they'll provide valuable funding, experience and a platform to those who might attract further investment down the line.
Yeah. As Marcus touched on, they're also raising the profile of carbon removal more generally. XPRIZE are using their name, status and resources to give some validity to these potentially risky investments. That can really open doors for more investment from a broad range of investors who may trust XPRIZE but not know all that much about carbon removal themselves. These are a fairly new suite of technologies. You can understand why some investors might be risk averse when it comes to backing projects in this area. This $100 million feels like a real statement of trust in the technical and commercial viability of this industry as a whole. And that can only be a good thing, not to mention the wider press it's getting and the conversations that will inevitably be sparked in the media and amongst the general public as a result. I can see this helping a whole host of carbon removal entrepreneurs gain traction, beyond just those who are successful in the prize itself. But as we've talked about so many times, this space is full of complexities, riddled with complexities, you might say. And I can imagine that considering all of those complexities in the administration and judging of a prize like this is a real challenge. How do you boil everything down into a format that rewards innovation and future potential, but avoids some of the pitfalls that we've mentioned?
Well, these complexities are at the front and centre of the minds of the judging panel at XPRIZE. Marcus explained that the metrics that they're using for the prize are also what they see as key criteria for developing a healthy industry.
A few of the metrics that we're looking at are, I think, not surprising, but also really crucial to making sure carbon removal can matter for climate. So a couple of the metrics. One, the cost at scale. This is what everyone's first question is. This is all fine, but how much is it going to cost? Cost is a tricky one because it's hard to measure the cost of a developing technology today, because you know the cost today is not going to be the cost at full scale. But still, we're asking teams to give us their best guess, an educated model, educated specifically by their demonstration at smaller scale, or whatever scale they're at, and the data they collect about what the cost of deploying their solution at scale will be. Everything from capital costs to operating costs, potentially cost of labor, and cost of keeping the carbon sequestered over time. So that brings you to another important criteria. Permanence or durability is maybe a more nuanced way to say that. Our definition of carbon removal includes carbon capture, some kind of processing if that's required, and sequestration. So we're looking for a long-term storing of that carbon somehow. Another category is just actual performance. So I can't stress this enough. This is a demonstration competition. So actual measured performance of carbon removal and a lot of the variables that go into proving that that actually works. We want systems that are robust and actually work. And then we're also considering things like your land requirements, your energy requirements, which feed into cost but are important on their own. The actual net scale of your solution and whether it can be actually carbon negative over time, that's really important. And another criteria we're looking at, and this is sort of the last of the big ones, is equity and justice. Those aren't necessarily objectively measurable concepts, but they're crucial, we think, in the early stage development of carbon removal. The last thing the community wants to do is generate a set of solutions that 25 years from now cannot get any kind of social license or community acceptance for deployment. That's usually how we develop technologies. So if possible, we'd like to think about that early. Push solution developers to think about that now when they're at the idea stage or at the early pilot stage. What will this look like if you scale it to a gigaton? What social tensions will be created? How can we get ahead of those now? What stakeholders need to be brought into the conversation now so that we can at least make sure we're having a conversation about it, ideally avoid the worst of those negative consequences, because it doesn't help us if we just create a new problem 25 years from now, thinking we're solving one problem.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. That last point about equity and justice is particularly good to hear. As much as we want to be optimistic about these technologies and their potential to massively improve the planet and the futures of everyone living on it, we can't ignore some of their wider implications. Foresight isn't 2020. It isn't even 2021. And we can never predict the exact impact of emergent technologies. But it's reassuring to know that they are taking that really seriously.
Totally. I think it's also really key that Marcus mentioned both performance and permanence. We have talked incessantly about permanence over the last few weeks, and so we don't need to dwell too much on that space anymore. But it can be easy to forget that we need these technologies to work as we scale them up, that performance. It's very well proving your concept in a lab, but over the coming years, we'll undoubtedly see that some simply just can't deliver when you start that deployment at scale. This risks damaging trust in an industry that already faces some public perception hurdles. And it's super important that wherever possible, the money goes towards projects that might have a real scalable climate impact.
Yeah, it feels like a really steep hill to climb. It'll be interesting to look back in 10 or 20 years and look at this industry and ask what sort of an impact an initiative like the XPRIZE had and how important it might have been in getting some of those technologies off the ground.
Absolutely. And Marcus also described the scale of our challenge as unprecedented. But he pointed out that similar inventive models had a track record of accelerating scale-ups in the past.
I think it may be true, and check me on this, or maybe one of your listeners will check me on this, but I think the scale of development might be unprecedented or close to being unprecedented if we're truly going to get to, let's say, 10 gigatons by 2050, 10 gigatons net removed per year by 2050. No matter how you do the arithmetic, it's just a huge scale up. That's about a quarter of all the global CO2 emissions on Earth today. I don't know if there are any direct parallels, but I know there are a few great industries that have scaled to huge heights using early stage incentives. And this is sort of just stepping back through the history of innovation. Sometimes through prizes, or sometimes through things that are a little bit more nuanced, that aren't open competitions, but are more like bids or guaranteed purchase agreements. So there's a great example. I used to work in physics and engineering, especially electronics, and so I worked in semiconductor labs for a while, and microchips, things like that. Microchips are now ubiquitous, they're extremely cheap, but they're an incredibly sophisticated technology developed in the first and middle of last century. And like any sophisticated, complex technology, is expensive at first. One way that microchips were brought down in price massively was through economies of scale, but specifically the government stepped in to be the primary purchaser. In the United States, where I work, it was actually the United States government that stepped in to be one of the initial buyers of early microchips. And that essentially guaranteed a market for early developers, allowed them to rapidly innovate, allowed them to finally have a customer who could work with them, and then from there, truly generate a real open market where you have many customers, many suppliers, and sort of the price economics can flow from there.
Okay. All right. Marcus has fully convinced me. Next steps, Tom, we need to get cracking and apply for some of that sweet, sweet prize money. What do you say?
Well, we may have to refine our ideas just a little before we get to that. But in anticipation of that, I got the inside scoop from Marcus on a few things that startups in this space should consider, whether they're applying for the XPRIZE or just trying to raise investment in general.
Well, here's a couple. One, know that this is a pretty wide open space. There are a couple of great companies doing amazing things and really starting to scale in direct air capture, but in other areas. But it's going to take a community of solutions and a community of actors to actually achieve meaningful climate relevant scale here. So I think the space is still quite wide open. Second thing I would say is it's never been a better time to work on carbon removal. There's more interest than there ever was. So if you're not sure about whether you should jump in or you've been considering maybe putting a group together or joining a group to work on this, I think know that it won't be easy, but there's probably more resources available to you in terms of people, maybe capital, attention, policy interest than there ever has been. Maybe a specific piece of advice for the startups out there. I see a lot of pitches that start with, I have a great solution and I'm going to solve climate change. And I think the time is now to shift towards, we all get you're trying to solve climate change. We all get you think you have a great solution. Explain specifically how your solution can address a specific problem. So in carbon removal, focus more on the how and the who than the what and the why. People know the why now, and they even might know the what, carbon removal. Focus on how. How are you, how is your group, how is your team specifically going to address this?
That's very useful. I'm taking plenty of notes. Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you very much. It might also be worth checking out some of those projects that XPRIZE is already rewarding in this space. While the main carbon removal competition is still open, they recently actually awarded $5 million of the prize money to a number of student teams.
This is cool. Tell me more.
There's actually some really interesting businesses here. So one of them's called Skyrenu, and they actually station direct air capture technology on mine sites. And the captured carbon, which comes through the direct air capture machines, is then combined with mine tailings material. That's basically leftover material after the mining process. And they combine the two together to produce carbonated rocks for easy storage.
Nice.
Another really interesting one is called Blue Symbiosis. Blue Symbiosis essentially look to repurpose old oil and gas rigs out at sea and use them as seaweed farming infrastructure. Imagine just seaweed, but it's the sea version of trees. So they're great carbon sinks.
Very cool. Who knew seaweed could help us get out of this mess? Eh?
Oh,
Eh?
they're back.
We couldn't have a whole episode without any puns, Tom. That's just rude. So I think we're really beginning to see some of the growing excitement in this space. Marcus mentioned how the XPRIZE is hoping to leverage other funding, and so I wanted to reflect for a moment on what this might look like. Patricia Silva works in deal management at Green Angel Syndicate, the only angel investment syndicate in the UK specialising in the fight against climate change and global warming. Besides this, she's the co-founder and non-executive director of the Carbon Removal Centre in the UK. She gave us an overview of what the industry most needs to scale up.
Well, there are technologies there that already work, so you can remove carbon from the atmosphere, but they're still very expensive. So one thing that you have to tackle is reducing costs. And how can you do that? It's really putting more money into it. There's some investment, there's not enough yet at this moment to scale technologies. How can you scale that? In two ways, and doing more R&D to get research more on materials, for instance, absorbents. They are cheaper than the ones we use now, for instance, for direct air capture. And at the same time, you need deployments. So basically, if you create, for instance, a new direct air capture facility, the next time around that you build it, you're probably going to have costs cut into 30%. If you do it again after that one, you're going to have costs cut again by 30%. So you really have to go with the innovation by deployments. But again, you need the financing for that. So besides the financing, yeah, there are technologies there that can remove carbon from the atmosphere at this moment. But there are way more solutions out there that we need to look into, because we have direct air capture, but you cannot scale that up as quickly as we need. It's not just direct air capture or solutions that already work today and are still expensive. There's so much that we need to do. This is a portfolio approach that you have to take for carbon removal.
These are things that we keep coming back to. One, we need to continue to develop and deploy our existing technologies. And two, we need to develop an industry that supports this portfolio of options.
Right. Something the Carbon Removal Centre has realised is that this requires support for entrepreneurs and innovators, the people building the companies and engineering the technologies that are going to be the future players in this industry. That's us, by the way, Tom. The only way to have a healthy carbon removal ecosystem is to ensure that the people with the good ideas have the support they need from day one. Patricia talked about some of the barriers that they, or indeed we, might face.
There's a lot of ways that innovators find barriers. One of them is basically creating an environment where they need to understand how a business can be created. So that's the general thing. It's not specific for carbon removal technologies, but for any entrepreneur that's navigating in this startup world for the first time. Another one is definitely the financing. Where it can be issues around the financing, it's a bit of mix with the business model. So you need to create a business model in order for a startup to get usually private funding, not just grant funding. So that is an issue nowadays, because in the carbon removal space, usually the revenues can come from utilizing the carbon. Can be to store it permanently, but it's hard to find business models for carbon sequestration at the scale that we need. And if you create a lot of utilization, there's $1 trillion market out there according to Carbon 180, but that is still not enough to remove the quantities of carbon that we need in order to keep the planet in safe temperature levels. So we really need to store it underground, and we still haven't found enough business models, revenue streams for that. Also creating partnerships with companies that are trying to get to their net zero goals, for instance. So how can they back solutions focus on carbon removal? So if we can help these entrepreneurs getting to the right partnerships with corporations, we will potentially help them in succeeding faster.
So much of this comes down to money, but it's actually a lot bigger than that. When we talk about financing carbon removal, it's super easy to forget that this has, so many facets, whether that's investing in early stage businesses, creating viable business models, or creating partnerships between those who can do the carbon removal and those who want it done. There's just a lot of opportunity for creativity here, particularly given this industry is trying to find its feet still.
So the Carbon Removal Centre is a collaboration of entrepreneurs, companies, academics and practitioners. It hosts live events and seminars and gives all members a chance to share information, solve problems, and participate in the wider debate around carbon removal. This is the community that we've already said we needed, Tom.
And as someone who's run a small business in the past, I know it can be super demoralizing if it feels as though you're the only one working on something that you consider to be so important. And that feeling of being part of something bigger can really help keep you going in those difficult moments as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. Patricia talked about how collaboration is key to realizing some of that potential that you mentioned and some of the broader goals of the Carbon Removal Centre.
So the Carbon Removal Center was created with the goal of addressing the gaps within the carbon removal ecosystem. So if we can fill in those gaps, we can accelerate the ecosystem. And that's our goal, because timing is everything in terms of getting to some solutions on climate. So that was the main goal. So we decided to create an organization that was very participatory, very inclusive, to really address everyone's issues and everyone's concerns. And we don't want solely to focus on corporate interests or nations' interests or a specific technology. We're agnostic in the technology as long as it's proven it's safe. We really want to accelerate any solutions in any way. And we really want to develop that independent thinking around the carbon removal arena to really get to that goal of deploying a diverse range of solutions in an equitable and just manner. So currently, we're just wrapping up developing a playbook for corporates to help them out navigating the carbon removal space. We're also going to be supporting an accelerator that its focuses on climate. So one of the big missions they have is supporting ideas and solutions in carbon drawdown. So we're going to be mentoring and helping out in that space. And we have a number of other projects coming out, especially doing partnerships with organizations that are thinking about doing something in the space.
Yeah, again, it's really striking to see that both Marcus and Patricia have mentioned equity and justice as key parts of this.
Exactly. When we compare what's currently happening in carbon removal to previous industrial and technological revolutions, it's worth noting that this may be the first time that we've both had to scale a technology like this for the benefit of humanity, and perhaps the first time that we've had conversations about justice at its core. I find that really interesting. And it feels like spaces like the Carbon Removal Centre offer that possibility, putting dialogue and debate at the heart of this evolving industry, and bringing experts from a range of disciplines into that conversation. With this in mind, I asked Patricia, what role might the Carbon Removal Centre play in the future of this industry?
Well, I think it's going to be the facilitator. So nowadays, people come to us from the startup space, from corporates, as well as consultants, and come to seek for technical advice or connection. So we're going to be the ones making and connecting the dots and understanding how things work, how things are developing in the finance side. We're going to be advising the government with new policies and regulations that make sense according to what we hear from our group of people in the various areas. So what I feel like is that we're not going to be leading anything. We're going to be facilitating others to do their parts in the advocacy side, in the technology space, in the financing side. And this is kind of the idea that I have.
As an entrepreneur in this space, you potentially have the opportunity to shape some of the key policies that are going to be coming through in the next coming years and decades. Through working with someone like the Carbon Removal Centre or other folks like Carbon 180.
That's so exciting. It's like the power is in your hands to shape this whole industry.
So we've got our business off the ground, whether it's the biochar bakery or something else. We've got support from the Carbon Removal Centre, and we may have even bagged ourselves some cash from the XPRIZE.
I love this confidence, Tom. Let's roll with it.
But what next? As we emerge into this industry, how do we know it's going to be set up for us to sell our carbon removal to our customers? We spoke last time about the importance of marketplaces to help make carbon removal happen. But, of course, marketplaces are themselves businesses, which face many of the same challenges as other carbon removal companies. And one marketplace with a novel approach is Patch. We spoke to Brennan, the co-founder and CEO of Patch, to look at how their model is providing a unique solution to some of the challenges that we've discussed. And knowing that Patch received investment from the likes of venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, the first thing we wanted to ask him was, what convinced them to invest?
I mean, truthfully, at least in the context of Andreessen Horowitz, they were looking at us as a marketplace business. So they said, hey, we have this non-standardized, opaque, low trust market that we believe is going to grow 50 to 100 times over the next 5 to 10 years. And here's a piece of software, Patch, that is basically standardizing and making that ecosystem more transparent and easy to transact with. And that's really it. Like that's really like if you have that, whether it's with home sharing or with ride sharing or whatever, that's usually the kind of thought process then with evaluation of marketplace businesses, which do we think the team has the ability to build a product that can make this difficult to access, a growing market, easier to access? And if you really check all those boxes, it's very, I'll say in air quotes, easy to get to the conclusion to say yes to a particular investment. So that's really the lens. The fact that we were climate related didn't really matter. It was really more of a component of we think climate's going to be big. But at the end of the day, it just came down to, do the market mechanics make sense? And do we think that this team can accomplish it?
That's really interesting. Saving the world is a great goal, but the business model to get there is just as important.
You know, Marcus was hinting at a similar point here. What we're basically seeing is that when it comes to putting forwards a compelling business case to have somebody invest in you or partner with you, the businesses need to focus on the outputs first as opposed to the outcomes. The outputs are make sure that you've got a working business model with customers that want to buy your product or service. And the outcome of that functioning business model is that you will be helping to save the planet.
Yeah, interesting. And for many businesses operating in this space, having a workable business model will rely on having a place to sell the carbon that they're removing in the form of credits. Brennan reminded us of the role that marketplaces can play in the future of carbon removal, both to generate revenue long term and to attract investors who need the promise of that revenue.
At the end of the day, I have a really tough time seeing a world where only policymakers pay for this with tax dollars, where it's just some sort of public utility. And so at the end of the day, like these projects need to get financed, typically with some form of project finance. In order to do that, you need to be able to show that there's minimal market risk. So you can actually sell and make money off this investment and pay back that project finance, as well as potentially make some sort of operating income because you have to pay the people running the facility. And so I'm open to like other forms of monetizing these projects, but I don't think charity operates at the right scale. And I really don't think that I'd be surprised if policy made anything else than like, say, tax advantages for these types of projects. But I don't see them doing direct spending on carbon removal, for example, in which case you're just going to need some way to monetize these types of projects.
As Brennan said, I think it needs underlining that in the absence of other viable revenue streams, marketplaces are just absolutely crucial to this picture. And a few moments ago, Patricia touched on how the capacity of the utilization space, though it's significant, will eventually face limits. There's only so much carbon that we'll be able to sell to industry, and that alone won't be enough to help us meet our climate goals. And we've said time and time again that policy was behind on this, so marketplaces are just having to pick up a lot of the slack here.
Right, but it's a big task. And we discussed this in episode 6. If we're asking marketplaces to be the prime demand driver of this space, they need to be designed in such a way that they're easy to use, that they're trusted by the customers, and that they incentivize good practice when it comes to purchasing the right kinds of carbon credits. You know, that prioritizes the high quality, measurable, and long-lasting removal options.
And this is exactly what Patch has set out to achieve. In lay terms, Patch enables any company to embed their carbon footprint estimations directly into their digital products and experiences. As a company, you can then make automatic offset purchases when a customer makes that purchase. So if, for example, I were to buy a pair of trousers from company X, which have a carbon footprint of, say, 5 kilograms of CO2, that 5 kilograms is converted into a footprint purchase on the other end, offsetting the emissions of that product. Brennan goes on to describe their wider goal.
Patch is really an attempt to do two things. One, make it incredibly easy to gain access to these carbon removal technologies. So again, if you look at the composition of these teams, it's primarily that thing that I am not, which are these either like chemical engineers, mechanical engineers. They're primarily focusing on developing and scaling this potentially novel type of technology. And they're not really focused on maybe go to market or developing software systems to run their business. And so basically Patch bridges that gap. The other piece to keep in mind is if we are going to get to that, 10 or 15 gigaton goal, that's 15 trillion kilograms a year. Okay, so it's going to come from hundreds of billions of transactions, which require hundreds of billions of carbon calculations and capital allocations to get that CO2 out of the air. And the thought process behind Patch is, well, whenever hundreds of billions of a particular process happen, it's either on maybe like the subatomic level or it's a computer doing it. And so how do you actually build a system that can plug into the existing systems of record that we built today, whether that's a travel management system, payment facilitator, an e-commerce platform? There's loads of different options there to kind of automate and kind of put this piece of process on autopilot.
The Patch approach is notable here because it democratizes purchasing carbon removal. For businesses who want to buy credits to offset a proportion of their emissions, Patch removes a lot of the hurdles that they might previously have faced. There's no need to have a big research or analyst team or paying big sums to consultants. It makes the barrier to entry so much lower. And by using a system like this, you're eliminating quite a few steps in a usually long-winded process.
Right. And crucially, this means more companies, particularly smaller or medium-sized businesses, can direct resources towards carbon removal, which in turn can pump more money towards particular projects and the space as a whole. This is what really excites me about Patch's approach. It can turn carbon removal offsetting from something that's normally the preserve of large corporations into something that could be normalized for businesses of all shapes and sizes.
Now, of course, it's important that customers can trust the carbon removal they're paying for. And Patch do the hard work of completing that due diligence on all the carbon removal projects on their platform.
So that is one differentiator, the idea or kind of distinguishing component where, you don't have to actually perform diligence on each one of these different types of partners and kind of quote unquote, what we say, like get smart on the subject, but rather kind of, it really dramatically reduces what we call the activation energy of participating in carbon removal, where if you could write a couple lines of code, which at least out here in Silicon Valley, a lot of people can do that. Very much fewer people can kind of evaluate these different forms of carbon removal. You can really bring a lot more people into the ecosystem.
Thinking ahead, it's possible to imagine some of the benefits that this kind of automated approach to carbon removal could have for this industry. The more ubiquitous this becomes, the more the end customer might legitimately start to expect to see this offered from businesses that they're buying from. When I'm shopping online, I'd like to see that the product I'm buying or the shipping I'm choosing can be offset in some way, in a way that I trust. It's possible that as these sorts of platforms roll out, consumers could expect greater accountability when it comes to offsetting the carbon cost of what they're buying.
Completely. And if marketplaces like Patch are able to maintain, a healthy scrutiny of their removals products that they offer, we could also see greater trust and credibility start to come across the whole industry. In this case, you're then not just relying on a corporation's word that they're buying the removals they say they are. When it comes to building up that set of offset options, Brennan again echoed the portfolio approach that so many of our other guests have come back to from time to time.
The other thing to call out, though, is that most large corporates are never going to compensate their entire footprint through one technology type. An analogy I like to actually bring is related to financial products, is you wouldn't put all of your money, unless you were incredibly audacious, into one stock, right? So even if you think you believe the most in that, you're always going to have hedges, you're always going to want to diversify your portfolio to mitigate risk. And that's the same thought process that most large enterprises take with mitigating their carbon footprint as well. And so what Patch does is it also gives you one unified interface to access basically 30 to 40 plus different types of technologies or project types in one place. And so you have the opportunity to both standardize and compare apples to apples, all these strengths and weaknesses of different technology types. They all have different, what I would describe as pros and cons. And typically what we do at Patch is allow people to build portfolios and have basically these characteristics blended across them all. So you actually understand how you're compensating your footprint and basically the different attributes associated with your portfolio.
I think a reason to make sure our approach to this is diverse is that homogeneity is part of what got us into this mess in the first place. Think of monocultures. They cause all kinds of issues for the soil, for wildlife, for the crops themselves. Finding one thing and sticking to it is a surefire way of burning through resources and setting yourself up for complete meltdown in the face of any unforeseen hiccups.
And there's nothing worse than an unforeseen hiccup. Am I right?
They can really sneak up on you, Tom, we started this episode with a long wish list of things we need to make this industry grow and fulfill the potential that it really needs to fulfill. And listening to our guests, I don't know, I'm very optimistic. I'm coming away from this feeling like we're not there yet, but it feels possible. And it feels possible with the urgency that we really need.
I totally agree. And something that is really noteworthy for me was the opportunity that is still there for entrepreneurs. Sometimes perhaps when we're so kind of deeply involved in this space, you think that we've missed the boat when it comes to setting up a carbon removal company. But as you said, we're still only at the scale of thousands of tons, and we need to get to billions of tons. So there's so much to do still, and so many more people that need to get involved.
Yeah, I suppose that thing of there's so much more to do can be quite intimidating and scary. But then you talk to the people who are doing things and it's like, oh, actually, there's so much more to do. And that makes it really exciting and really interesting. And there's just so much untapped potential.
I wanted to ask you, what did you think about the idea of focusing on the outputs as opposed to the outcomes?
Yeah, see, that one's interesting to me, right? Because there's so much talk at the minute about like purpose-led businesses that have like a vision and a mission of changing the world, saving the rainforests, etc. And so for us to be like, okay, everyone listening to our podcast, young entrepreneurs, don't focus on saving the world, focus on your business model. It's, strong capitalist undertones that I'm not sure I feel comfortable with. But I totally understand what we're talking about here, because in order to actually have the impact that your mission states you want to have, you have to have a viable business. Well, I mean, you can go in without a viable business model and find some other source of funding, but then you're not really a business. You're like a foundation or a charity or something different. We're talking about creating a marketplace, a business environment, then you've got to have commercial viability.
And in our society, that's where you then attract the large amounts of investment and commercial opportunities that you might not otherwise get if you're operating in the NGO space or in the charitable space.
Yeah, that's true. What I think is really interesting though, Tom, is this question of we are living in transformational times, I reckon, especially when it comes to climate and how that desire for impact interacts with business. We've actually got an industry that we really need to scale up. And so that in itself is really interesting to me. We're talking about purpose-led businesses. The whole industry is purpose-led. Fundamentally, we're doing this to save the planet, right? So as long as that remains as a bottom line and the integrity of that is a strong foundation, I think, we can see some really exciting things in this space. The problem, of course, is when we start to waver from that and we get to points of greenwashing and all those other things that we've already talked about. But with that foundation of we're doing this because the planet and humanity needs it, then I'm that is really exciting.
To build on that, perhaps this industry can be a bit of a North Star for others to follow. Who's to say that this industry doesn't kind of catalyze others that perhaps haven't got that focus? And so it's then kind of the outcomes are just baked into the industries. Every business just inherently is better for the planet due to the way that it operates. I mean, that is blue sky thinking, but perhaps that's where we could eventually get to, or we might need to get to.
Yeah, I mean, we're here to think big, Tom. That's why they pay us the big bucks.
This episode has really summarized the need and opportunity of scaling up the carbon removal industry. but also we need to start thinking about how else we can bring others along that journey. How can we engage and bring them along with the development and growth of this nascent space?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Tom. We need to think beyond the people who are directly involved in this industry. Next time on the Carbon Removal Show, we'll be talking all about public perception of carbon removal.
Thank you so much to our team who make this series possible.
Our researcher and fact-checker, Henry Irvine.
Our composer, Sam Carter.
Our graphic designer, Reke Campbell.
Our editor, Mercy Barno.
Our producer, Ben Weaver-Hinks.
Our project manager, Patrick Carter.
And our executive producer, Sam Floy.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Carbon Removal Show. As ever, I've been Tom Praviti, and I've been joined by Emily Swaddle.
Remember to subscribe today if you haven't done so already.
And if you've got a second, don't forget to leave us a review while you're there.
For more information about the show and carbon removal, visit restored.cc. Until next time.
See ya.
Co-fruition.